Welcome back, everyone, to our prayer journey with Mike Toth. And today, our journey, stepping through the book of Ruth. I'm going to start by reading right away one verse, or part of one verse. Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. It is important for me to pause here to give you the lay of the land at this particular point. What does this mean when judges ruled? Well, judges are not the judges we see in the Supreme Court today with robes on. These judges were men and women put in by God to bring law and order back. You see, during this particular time, there was a downward spiral of the land of Israel. It lasted for about 300 years. Ruth is probably written in the first 100 or 150 years of the book of Judges. But it got progressively worse. And this is one of the reasons we should be praying all the time. You see, in the book of Judges, it says that at this time, they had no use for God, most of the nation. And everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So prayer, what would happen? Men and women of God would pray and say, God, bring back law and order. And God would raise up a judge. And law and order would return for a period of time. And God would be represented. But then what happened? As soon as things were okay for a while, they would fall back again because they didn't want to worship God. There was no king in the land, just judges. And the judges came as they prayed. All right, so this is the land lay for Ruth at this particular time. All right, it is a bad time for them to be going through it. Plus, there's a famine in the land. Can you imagine no law and order and a famine in the land? Wild West and no food. So we'll pick up and continue to read verse 1 here. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So a decision is made to be pilgrims in Moab because there is bread there. He probably, most likely, whatever property he owned, mortgaged off to have the money and resources to make the journey into Moab with protection because it's not a safe place to go. In fact, it's a heathen land. And in the land, there was also child sacrifice. People would sacrifice their children to gain in crops. So we pick it up in verse 2. And the name of the man was Abimelech, which means God is king. Yet he left God behind in Israel. The name of his wife, Naomi. Sweetness and pleasantness is her name. And the name of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. This means sickness and destruction. And we're going to see this is what they're going to face. They're Ephraites of Bethlehem, Judah, which means that they travel from another part of Israel to this particular area of Bethlehem, Judah, which means house of praise and bread. So they moved there. So they had a history of migrating a little bit. All right. And they came into the country of Moab and continue there. Now, we go on to verse 3. And Abimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. It doesn't say how long and how old these sons were, but she was left with them. At this point, it was, we see when we look at the story of Isaac, they would have went back to the land and married a good Jewish woman. But Naomi does not go back. She decides to stay in the land, and watch what happens here, all right, in verse 4. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. This would be sacrilege and take them out of anything in the land of Israel. But God can make any decision a good decision when he corrects things, when we do things right. And we're going to see that's what's going to happen. So he took them 2 women of the Moab, and the name of one was Ophrah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelled in the land about 10 years. All right, so they're in this land for about 10 years. Ophrah means like a fawn or a deer, And Ruth means friendship, and she proves herself to be very friendly and a real friend as we go into the story. And Mahlon and Chilion died, also both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and a husband. Now they're faced with a dilemma. They have nothing substantial. They probably are living hand to mouth. So Naomi, now in verse 6, all right, then she arose with her daughters-in-law, and that she might return from the country of Moab, for she heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people, Israel, and giving them bread. So she wants to go back. Why? Not for God yet, but for bread. But for whatever reason, she turns to go back. That's her goal. Wherefore, she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. This is the process of starting to turn and go back to their country. We're going to see on the next, as we pick up this Bible study in verse 8, that this decision is going to bring them to a place where another decision needs to be made. A decision of, are they going to go into the world, or are they going to go back to the promised land and to God? So until next time, may Jesus increase as we decrease.